In the pre-dawn stillness of August 1st, 1589, in a house at St. Cloud overlooking a Paris besieged and boiling with hatred, the King of France was preparing for his day. This was not a king forged in the mold of his warrior ancestors. This was Henry III, the last of the Valois, a man who moved through the world as if it were a stage, draped in silks and velvets, his face a carefully composed mask of white lead powder, his earlobes heavy with pearls. He was a monarch who governed a kingdom tearing itself apart with the same meticulous attention he gave to the ruff around his neck or the scent on his gloves. He was surrounded by his loyal guards, the fearsome 45, and was at the precipice of retaking his capital from the fanatical Catholic League that had driven him out. Victory seemed, for the first time in years, not just possible, but imminent. Into this scene of calculated power and personal fastidiousness walked a young Dominican friar named Jacques Clement, professing to carry a secret message of utmost urgency for the king alone. What happened next was not merely an assassination. It was the brutal, visceral collision of two irreconcilable worlds. It was the moment the carefully constructed artifice of Henry's life was punctured, quite literally, by the cold, hard steel of religious zealotry, ending a dynasty and plunging France deeper into the abyss. How does a king, born to the most powerful dynasty in Europe, a celebrated military hero in his youth, and the anointed ruler of two separate kingdoms, end up murdered by a monk, reviled by his people, and remembered by history as a perverted, effeminate failure? The story of Henry III is not a simple tale of a weak king. It is a far more complex and tragic narrative about the destruction of a man whose personality, intelligence, and even his aesthetics were utterly misaligned with the savage brutality of his age. It is the story of how private habits and personal expression can be weaponized in the public square, how propaganda can become a more lethal weapon than any sword. To understand Henry's fall is to peel back layers of carefully crafted slander, to look past the caricature of the Rouge King playing with his lapdogs, and to find a deeply intelligent, sensitive, and tormented ruler trapped in a collapsing world. His reign was a battle, not just for the soul of France, but for his own, fought against the specters of his powerful mother, the shadows of his inadequate brothers, the unyielding hatred of religious fanatics, and the crushing weight of a crown he was never meant to wear. The life of Henry III is a profound cautionary tale. It demonstrates with chilling clarity that in an age of absolute belief, a ruler's greatest crime is not tyranny or incompetence, but ambiguity. Henry was a man of nuance in an era that demanded iron certainty. He sought a middle path in a nation that saw only the righteous road or the path to damnation. His attempts at creating a modern, centralized state, loyal to the crown above all else, were perceived as a decadent assault on tradition. His sophisticated, Italian-at-court culture was decried as a foreign corruption of French masculinity. The very body of the king, what he wore, how he spoke, whom he loved, and his tragic failure to produce an heir, became the central battlefield in the French wars of religion. The dagger of Jacques Clement was merely the final, punctuating blow in a long and systematic assassination of character, a murder that had been plotted and preached in the pulpits of Paris for over a decade. This is the story of that murder, in all its political, psychological, and physical horror. Born Alexander Ward de Valois-Guillaume in 1551, he was the fourth son of King Henry II of France and the formidable Catherine de' Medici. From his earliest days, he was different. While his brothers were gruff, athletic, and unremarkable in intellect, the young Duke of Anjou was slight, elegant, and possessed of a precocious intelligence that captivated his mother. Catherine, the master political strategist, saw in this son a reflection of her own Florentine cunning and aesthetic sensibilities. He was her favorite, her masterpiece, the child in whom she invested her greatest hopes. She showered him with affection and oversaw his education, ensuring he was fluent in Italian, a connoisseur of art and literature, and a master of the courtly graces. He was charming, eloquent, and dangerously clever, learning early on to navigate the treacherous currents of the French court. a world of shifting alliances, whispered conspiracies, and sudden violence that had been the backdrop of his entire childhood. The wars of religion had erupted when he was a boy, and the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, a stain on his family's legacy, occurred under the reign of his brother Charles IX, shaping his understanding of the lethal potential of religious division. The society into which Henry was born held rigid, almost primal expectations for its monarchs. A king was meant to be a warrior, first and foremost. He was expected to lead his armies from the front, to be virile, overtly masculine, and to project an image of unshakable Catholic piety. His primary dynastic duty was simple and absolute: to produce a healthy male heir to secure the continuation of the line. Anything less was seen as a failure not just of the man, but of the divinely ordained order. The France Henry was destined to inherit was a fractured kingdom, a land poisoned by decades of civil war between the Catholic majority and the Protestant Huguenot minority. Power was not neatly centralized in the hands of the monarch. It was contested by powerful noble families, chief among them the ultra-Catholic House of Guise, who saw themselves as the true defenders of the faith and commanded the fierce loyalty of the Parisian mob. It was a world that had no room for compromise, a society that saw the perfumed glove as a symbol of weakness and the scholar's book as a poor substitute for the soldier's sword. Before the crown of France crushed him, Henry knew moments of astonishing success that belie the later caricature of an ineffectual fop. In his late teens, he was given command of the royal army and, against all expectations, proved to be a surprisingly effective military leader. At the battles of Jarnac and Moncontour in 1569, he won decisive victories against Huguenot forces, earning him acclaim across Catholic Europe. He was hailed as a hero, the worthy son of Henry II. His martial reputation, combined with the tireless diplomatic efforts of his mother, led to one of the most remarkable achievements of his life: his election in 1573, at the age of 21, to the throne of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. He was now King Henryk Walesy, ruler of a vast, diverse, and distant kingdom. It was the zenith of his young life, a testament to his charm, his intellect, and his perceived potential. He was a victorious general and a king in his own right, seemingly poised for a glorious European career. This image of the conquering hero, the elected king, is the essential baseline from which we must measure his later, tragic descent. It is the ghost of the king he might have been, had fate not intervened with such brutal swiftness. The turning point, the catalytic event that sealed his fate, came less than a year into his Polish reign. In May 1574, a messenger arrived bearing news from France. His brother, King Charles IX, was dead. Charles had been a weak and troubled ruler, haunted by the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, and had died without a legitimate male heir. By the laws of succession, the throne of France now belonged to Henry. The Polish crown, once a spectacular prize, was now a gilded cage. In a move that shocked his Polish subjects and signaled the desperation of his ambition, Henry abandoned his kingdom in the dead of night, fleeing across Europe to claim the far greater and far more perilous prize that awaited him. His journey back was not a triumphant procession, but a hurried, almost furtive flight. He was no longer the dashing Duke of Anjou. He was Henry III, king of a France that was bankrupt, ungovernable, and drowning in blood. Upon his return, the immediate consequences of his new reality became starkly apparent. The kingdom was in chaos. The treasury was empty. The great noble houses vied for power, and religious armies roamed the countryside. Henry's first acts as king were to set the tone for his entire reign, a mixture of heartfelt intention and political miscalculation. Instead of immediately marching on his enemies, he embarked on a tour of religious processions and penance, a theatrical display of piety that many found unsettling and bizarre. Then, in a stunning break with royal tradition, he rejected the politically advantageous European princesses offered to him and instead married for love. His chosen bride was Louise de Lorraine, a gentle and pious woman from a junior branch of the powerful Guise family. While a deeply devoted union, it was a political disaster. It failed to secure a powerful foreign alliance and only partially placated the ambitious Guise clan, who had hoped for a more direct link to the throne. Furthermore, his first major political act was to sign the Peace of Monsieur in 1576, granting significant concessions to the Huguenots in an attempt to end the Civil War. For hardline Catholics, this was not peacemaking, it was heresy. From the very outset, Henry had alienated the fanatics, confused the traditionalists, and asserted a personal, emotional style of rule that the kingdom was simply not prepared to accept. The path to his destruction was already being paved. The central, escalating crisis of Henry's reign was his profound inability to pacify the kingdom or to sire an heir. These two failures became inextricably linked, feeding a vicious cycle of political instability and personal delegitimization. The peace treaties he brokered were invariably short-lived, collapsing under the weight of mutual hatred and the machinations of the Catholic League. Led by the charismatic and dangerously popular Henry, Duke of Guise, the League presented itself as the true champion of Catholic France, implicitly casting the king as, at best, a lukewarm sympathizer and, at worst, a secret heretic. This narrative was powerfully amplified by a network of radical priests and pamphleteers, funded by Philip II of Spain, who had every interest in keeping France weak and divided. They preached sermons of sedition from the pulpits of Paris, painting the king as a godless tyrant, a sodomite who surrounded himself with corrupt favorites while the true faith languished. The problem of the succession became a ticking bomb at the heart of the kingdom. Year after year, Henry and Queen Louise failed to conceive a child. The court became a hotbed of whispered rumors and desperate remedies. The king and queen made pious pilgrimages to shrines famed for their fertility boons, and the king subjected himself to humiliating medical examinations. The failure was laid squarely at his feet. His perceived effeminacy and the intense, intimate friendships he shared with the handsome young men at his court were offered as public proof of his impotence or, worse, his disinterest in his queen. The crisis reached a fever pitch in 1584 with the death of Henry's last remaining brother and heir, François, Duke of Anjou. According to Salic law, which barred succession through the female line, the next in line to the throne was now a Protestant, the king's distant cousin, Henry of Navarre. For the Catholic League and the majority of the French population, the prospect of a heretic king was an abomination, a fate to be resisted by any means necessary, including open rebellion against the reigning monarch. The succession crisis was no longer a theoretical problem. It was an existential threat to the Catholic identity of France, and Henry III stood directly in the path of the League's solution. In the face of this escalating political and personal crisis, Henry did not remain passive. His attempts to regain control, however, were consistently misinterpreted and often backfired spectacularly. He understood that the old feudal power of the great nobles, particularly the Guises, was a direct threat to the crown. To counter this, he cultivated a group of loyal followers, men of lesser nobility who owed their wealth and status directly to him. These were the infamous Mignons, or darlings. They were renowned for their extravagant fashion, their elaborately coiffed hair, their starched ruffs, their jeweled earrings, and their deadly skill with a rapier. They were Henry's confidants, his bodyguards, and his agents. In their fierce, often fatal duels with the retainers of the Duke of Guise, they defended the king's honor with a fanaticism that mirrored the League's own religious zeal. But to the public, these men were not a new model of royal service. They were symbols of corruption, decadence, and unnatural affection. The propaganda of the League painted them as the instruments of the king's perverted desires, draining the royal treasury to fund their lavish lifestyles. Henry's attempt to build a modern, loyal bureaucracy was seen only through the distorted lens of his personal life. Henry also sought to recenter the mystique of the monarchy around himself through grand, symbolic gestures. In 1578, he established the Order of the Holy Spirit, France's most prestigious chivalric order. Its motto, Duce et Auspice, under his guidance and auspices, was a clear statement that loyalty was owed to God and his chosen king, not to feudal lords or religious factions. It was a brilliant piece of political theater, an attempt to create a new elite bound by oath to the person of the monarch. Yet, like his other efforts, it was seen as another example of his extravagance and self-obsession. His attempts at fiscal reform, meant to refill the empty coffers of the state, were met with outrage by a populace already burdened by taxes and convinced the money was being squandered on courtly frivolities. Every logical policy move was refracted through the prism of his public image, an image he seemed incapable of changing and which his enemies exploited with ruthless efficiency. His interventions were not seen as the desperate gambits of a king trying to hold his kingdom together, but as the indulgent whims of a ruler who had lost touch with reality. The relentless pressure and public vitriol took a profound psychological and emotional toll on the king. The court of Henry III became a strange, hermetic world, a fortress of ritual and luxury against the hatred raging outside its walls. His behavior grew more erratic, swinging between periods of feverish activity and bouts of deep, melancholic lethargy. He would throw himself into the minutiae of state administration one day, and the next would be found weeping in his chambers, surrounded by his beloved lapdogs. His piety intensified, taking on forms that shocked and disturbed even his contemporaries. He organized and participated in bizarre processions of penitence, marching through the streets of Paris barefoot in a sackcloth robe, flagellating himself alongside his courtiers. These displays, like the confraternities of white, blue, and black penitents he established, were deeply sincere expressions of his tormented faith and his belief that France's suffering was a divine punishment for sin, perhaps his own. But to his enemies, they were not acts of faith. They were grotesque theater, further proof of a king whose mind was becoming unhinged, a ruler performing his own psychological breakdown on a public stage. This withdrawal into a private world of ritual, art, and intense, exclusive friendships was a classic defense mechanism. The outer world was uncontrollable, violent, and hateful. Within the Louvre, however, he could create a space of order, beauty, and loyalty. He surrounded himself with artists, poets, and musicians. He spent fortunes on clothes, jewels, and perfumes, not necessarily out of simple vanity, but as a way of asserting a different kind of power, the power of culture, sophistication, and royal magnificence. In an age of brute force, he championed the aesthetic. But this very retreat confirmed the public's worst suspicions. He was seen as a king who preferred the company of parrots and painters to that of generals and ministers. The more the world outside screamed for a warrior king, the more Henry III refined his performance as an artist king, a fatal disjuncture that alienated him completely from his subjects. His paranoia grew, and with good reason. He trusted no one beyond his inner circle of minions and his aging mother, and even her frantic attempts at diplomacy sometimes seemed to work at cross purposes to his own, deepening his sense of isolation. He was a king besieged, not yet by an army, but by the crushing psychological weight of his own crown. The careful balance of threats that Henry had managed for over a decade finally shattered on May 12, 1588. This was the day of the barricades, the point of no return. The Duke of Guise, emboldened by his immense popularity and Spanish funding, defied a direct royal command and entered Paris. He was met not as a traitor, but as a conquering hero. The citizens, whipped into a state of hysterical devotion by league preachers, hailed him as the savior of Catholic France. Cries of "Long live Guise" echoed through the streets, drowning out the authority of the king. Overnight, the city transformed into a revolutionary camp. Parisians, fearing the king would move against Guise with his Swiss guards, began to tear up paving stones, overturn carts, and chain off streets, erecting a web of barricades that trapped the king and his forces within the Louvre. For Henry III, this was the ultimate humiliation. He was a prisoner in his own capital, his authority evaporated, his life in peril. From the windows of the palace, He could see the armed citizenry and hear the cheers for his rival. His mother, Catherine, ever the negotiator, desperately tried to mediate, shuttling between the Louvre and the Duke of Guise's residence, but it was too late. The mob was in control, and the Duke was their king in all but name. Henry was faced with a stark choice: surrender to Guise and become his puppet, or flee. His state during these hours must have been a volatile cocktail of terror, fury, and wounded pride. The man who had cultivated an image of untouchable royal majesty was now cornered like a common fugitive. The carefully constructed facade of his reign had been smashed to pieces on the cobblestones of Paris. The key figures around him acted according to their natures. The Duke of Guise, intoxicated by his power, played a waiting game, confident that the king would be forced to capitulate and grant him the title of Lieutenant General of the kingdom, effectively making him the ruler of France. Catherine de' Medici, old and increasingly frail, saw her life's work of preserving the Valois dynasty crumbling before her eyes. She pleaded with both her son and with Guise, seeking a compromise where none was possible. And Henry, after a day of agonizing indecision, made his move. Realizing he was utterly outmaneuvered, he gave his guards a command. In a moment of supreme theatricality, he strolled out of the Louvre as if going for a walk, slipped through an unguarded gate, mounted a horse waiting at the Tuileries stables, and fled the city. As he looked back one last time at the capital that had betrayed him, he was said to have sworn a terrible oath that he would not return to Paris except through a breach in its walls as a conqueror. The flight was a profound act of powerlessness, but it was also the moment a cornered and humiliated king began to plot a terrible and bloody revenge. Having escaped Paris, Henry was a king in exile within his own kingdom. He was forced to temporarily accede to the Duke of Guise's demands, but it was a sham. The humiliation of the day of the barricades had festered within him, hardening his resolve. He understood now that coexistence with the House of Guise was impossible. One of them had to be destroyed. In December of 1588, 6 months after his flight from Paris, Henry summoned the Estates General to the royal Château de Blois. It was a grand political assembly, a gesture of reconciliation, but beneath the surface, a deadly plot was taking shape. Henry invited his great rival, the Duke of Guise, and the Duke's brother, Louis, the Cardinal of Guise, to attend. Despite warnings from his advisors that it was a trap, the Duke's arrogance was his undoing. He believed the king was too weak, too cowed, to ever act against him. He walked into the Château de Blois as the uncrowned king of France, confident of his own invincibility. On the morning of December 23, 1588, the trap was sprung. The Duke of Guise was summoned from a council meeting to a private audience with the king in his chambers. The route took him through a series of rooms where members of the 45, the king's personal guard, were stationed. These were men handpicked by Henry for their loyalty and ruthlessness. As Guise entered the king's bedchamber, the doors were barred behind him. He was set upon by the assassins. Though a powerful man who fought back fiercely, he was overwhelmed, stabbed repeatedly with daggers and swords. He collapsed at the foot of the king's bed, bleeding out on the floor. According to the chronicler Pierre de l'Estoile, Henry emerged from his study after the killing was done, looked down at the corpse of his magnificent rival, and coolly remarked, "My God, he is tall. He seems even taller dead than alive." The act was one of calculated, brutal statecraft. The next day, the Duke's brother, the powerful Cardinal of Guise, was also arrested and summarily executed in the chateau's dungeons. Henry had eliminated the heads of the serpent. Henry made no attempt to cover up the assassinations. On the contrary, he justified them as a righteous act of royal justice, a necessary execution, or tyrannicide, of traitors who sought to usurp his throne. He announced the news to his horrified mother, who was on her deathbed in the chateau. "I have made myself king of France this morning," he told her. "I have killed the king of Paris." Catherine was aghast, reportedly telling him, "God grant, my son, that you have not made yourself king of nothing." Her premonition was devastatingly accurate. The murder of the Guises did not crush the Catholic League. It galvanized it. The Duke and the Cardinal were instantly transformed into holy martyrs. The Sorbonne, the theological heart of Paris, officially declared that the people of France were released from their oath of allegiance to Henry III. The tyrant was now an excommunicated murderer, a heretic at war with God himself. The rage of Catholic France, which had been simmering for years, now exploded into open, implacable warfare against the king. In the wake of the Blois murders and the death of his mother, just weeks later, Henry III was more isolated than ever. He had lost his capital, the allegiance of most of his Catholic subjects, and the last great political advisor of his life. He controlled only a small portion of his own kingdom. Cornered in with no other options, he made the most astonishing and politically audacious decision of his reign. He performed a complete reversal, reaching out to the very man the League feared most, his Protestant heir, Henry of Navarre. In April 1589, the two Henrys, the Catholic king and the Huguenot leader, met and formed a military alliance. It was an act of supreme pragmatism, a recognition that the survival of the French state transcended religious division. For the first time, a royal army and a Huguenot army joined forces, united under a common cause, to crush the Catholic League and retake Paris. In the summer of 1589, their combined force of 40,000 men laid siege to the rebellious capital. It was from his headquarters at St. Cloud, watching his cannons bombard the city that had scorned him, that Henry prepared for his final, triumphant act. The assassination of Henry III on August 1st, 1589, was the direct, inevitable consequence of his murder of the Duke of Guise. The League, now led by the Duke's surviving brother, the Duke of Mayenne, preached a crusade of vengeance against the king. It was in this atmosphere of hysterical fanaticism that the young, unstable Dominican friar, Jacques Clement, became convinced that he was an instrument of God's will. He believed that assassinating the tyrant was not a sin, but a holy act that would guarantee his place in heaven. Gaining access to the royal camp at St. Cloud was surprisingly easy. He claimed to have vital intelligence from royalist sympathizers trapped inside Paris. Ushered into the king's presence, Clement waited until Henry was distracted, reading the letter the friar had handed him. He then drew a long knife concealed within his robes and plunged it deep into the king's lower abdomen. The king cried out in pain and shock, managing to pull the knife from his own body and strike his attacker before collapsing. His guards, the 45, rushed in and immediately killed Clement, hacking his body to pieces. The long-term consequences of that single knife thrust were monumental. Henry III lingered through the night in agony, but he remained lucid. In his final hours, he showed a courage and clarity that had often eluded him in life. He formally recognized Henry of Navarre as his legitimate successor and commanded the Catholic nobles present to swear allegiance to him for the sake of France's unity. "I pray you," he begged them, "as my friends and as your king, that after my death you will receive this gentleman." With his death on August 2nd, 1589, the House of Valois, which had ruled France for over 2.5 centuries, was extinct. His assassination did not end the war, it intensified it. Henry of Navarre became King Henry IV, but he was a king without a kingdom, rejected by the majority of his new subjects. It would take him another 4 years of brutal warfare and his famous, pragmatic conversion to Catholicism, reasoning that Paris is worth a mass, before he could finally unite the nation and bring the wars of religion to an end. The historical debate over Henry III began the moment he died and continues to this day. Was he the dissolute, depraved, and incompetent failure depicted in the savage propaganda of the Catholic League? Or was he a forward-thinking, misunderstood Renaissance prince, a victim of circumstance and slander? The truth, as is so often the case, lies in the complex territory between these extremes. The sources for his notorious reputation are almost entirely hostile. The pamphlets, sermons, and woodcuts financed by the League in Spain were a deliberate campaign of character assassination, using his genuine personal eccentricities, his love of fashion, his lapdogs, his intense male friendships, as political weapons to prove his unfitness to rule. They created a caricature so powerful that it has dominated the popular imagination for centuries. A more nuanced interpretation sees Henry not as a failure, but as a man out of time. His vision of a centralized monarchy, where loyalty was to the state personified by the king, rather than to feudal or religious factions, was fundamentally modern. His patronage of the arts, his refined court, and his intellectual pursuits were consistent with the ideals of a sophisticated Renaissance ruler. In a more peaceful era, he might have been celebrated as a French Lorenzo de' Medici, but he reigned in an age of iron. His attempts at compromise were seen as weakness, his cultural patronage as frivolity, and his complex psychology as madness. The question of his sexuality, so central to the slanders against him, remains ambiguous. While the intense, emotional bonds with his minions like the Duke of Joyeuse and the Duke of Epernon were undeniable, there is no definitive proof of a physical relationship. These bonds could have been a form of political brotherhood, an attempt to create an unshakable inner circle in a world of treachery. What is certain is that he loved his wife, Queen Louise, and was devastated by their childlessness. His tragedy was that in the brutal calculus of 16th century politics, his private self was his greatest public liability. The story of Henry III is ultimately a lesson in the terrifying power of intolerance and the fragility of political authority when it is divorced from popular perception. He was a king who understood the mechanics of statecraft, but failed to grasp the raw, primal emotions of his people. He believed in reason, negotiation, and the divine majesty of his office, but he was confronted by a holy war fueled by absolute faith and visceral hatred. His life demonstrates that a ruler can be destroyed not by their policies, but by their persona. The public image of the king in the pearl earring, the man who supposedly wore dresses at court festivals, became a more potent symbol for his enemies than any political grievance. He is a cautionary tale about the human cost of power, a symbol of a sophisticated world bleeding out under the relentless assault of fanaticism. There is a final, poignant contrast to be made between the public caricature of Henry and the private reality of his end. The League's propaganda painted him as a weak, cowardly voluptuary who had lost all claim to manhood and kingship. Yet, the historical record shows us something different. We see the king who coolly orchestrated the elimination of his most powerful enemy at Blois. We see the king who forged an unprecedented alliance with his Protestant rival to save the state. And we see the king who, on his deathbed, with a mortal wound in his stomach, thought not of his own agony, but of the future of France, securing the succession and pleading with his followers to place the unity of the kingdom above their religious prejudices. It was perhaps his finest and his last act of statesmanship. In the end, Henry III remains one of history's great enigmas, a figure of dazzling and tragic complexity. He was the last Valois king, and in many ways, he embodied the final, feverish bloom of the Renaissance spirit before it was extinguished by the grim certainties of the coming century. He was a man who wore a crown of gold and a mask of powder, who ruled with a scepter in one hand and a lapdog in the other. His life was a performance of majesty that failed to convince its audience, and his death was the tragic, bloody finale. He stands as a perpetual reminder that history is a battle of narratives, and that the truth of a human soul can be buried so deep beneath layers of slander and myth that it may never be fully recovered, leaving only the ghost of a king, forever misunderstood.